Welcome, everybody. Today, we're lucky enough to have two speakers. On my left, Dave Levine, who is a professor at the School of Law at Elon University and a CITP fellow, so you've seen Dave around. And also Victoria Stodden, who's a professor at the School of Library and Information Science at University of Illinois. And they're going to talk about this crazy idea that rules should be based on evidence.
And novel. So we are thrilled to be here, having both entered into separate dangerous journeys to get here. North Carolina, for those of you watching remotely, North Carolina had a surprise snowstorm this morning, and they don't handle known snowstorms well. And so I'm a betting man, and I didn't think I'd make it, but here I am. And Victoria had similar fun coming from a different part of the country. So we're gonna start this discussion by noting first that we're in an early stage of this work. We come at this issue of how empirical evidence is used from a lawmaking and policymaking perspective from somewhat different perspectives in terms of our substantive background. As many of you know, I focus on technology and intellectual property law policy and how it's made, and whether it's the Stop Online Piracy Act or access to generic medicines or algorithms and the like, IP laws had a challenge dealing with those regulatory issues. And so I enter into this world of procedural transparency, access, decision making from a substantive concern. And I've been drawn to this problem because of the lack of not just good evidence, but empirical evidence and scientific data used or not used internally in decision making. And so that's kind of my approach to it. And I think I'll have Victoria talk about her perspective and then why we're working together, and we'll get into the argument that we're making and how we're approaching it.
Yeah, no, I think that does touch on what we're doing. But I wanted to also say it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you. And as Dave mentioned, this is a fairly early stage project, so we really do appreciate the sort of casual, discussion-oriented nature, and I think I can speak for you too. We're both very happy for people to jump in at any point with questions. And we considered the slides something of a skeletal guide for what we might talk about to substantiate the discussion, not some kind of structure. So my background is, my PhD is in statistics, and then I went to law school after doing the statistics degree. And since then I've worked on a lot of issues at the intersection of how data science and big data interact with legal issues, and especially how computation is influencing how we do science, like whether we're doing science reliably or how this is changing how we disseminate science or the practice of science, for example. And so one of the things that I think motivated both of us around thinking about how scientific evidence interacts with policymaking and lawmaking, we're thinking primarily at the federal level, but I think the principles kind of, sort of flow down to all sorts of policymaking. In terms of how do you actually, if your rules, as a citizen in a democracy, are being based on particular pieces of scientific evidence, one might ask, how do I know I can trust those pieces of evidence? How do I know how those results were arrived at? How do I know that this isn't something that was, cherry-picked in support of a particular congressman's agenda, or this is something that represents a scientific consensus, or is this something where the science isn't settled, but we're doing the best we can, which is like 99.9% of all science. That's the reality of it. And so, so my interest was also in, when you bring in that computational element, and I will discuss this in great detail, but just to give you an overview, when you bring in that computational element, you bring in lots of complexity into how those results were derived at that's not necessarily transparent. And I'm not saying that before computation was heavily used in scientific discovery, it was all simple. That's certainly not the case. But we don't even have standards of disclosure around computational science that would allow you, even if you wanted to dig in and see what has been done in general. So how does that interact with lawmaking in a democracy that might, for example, rely on scientific evidence? And I think Dave raised another very good point, is maybe there are cases where we should be relying on evidence more, and we're not. Okay, so that hopefully that's a teaser for you. Okay, so here's what we kind of thought we might try to do today, depending on how the discussion goes. Framing the question, so I think what we'd like to do is postulate that this idea of evidence-based policy making, whether it's evidence-based medicine or evidence-based trade rules or whatever it is becoming or has become something of a meme, at least around Washington. You sort of hear this being batted around. And so the idea is if we can sort of postulate that this is something that's increasing or of increasing interest, which I don't think is necessarily the case, but if we sort of postulate this, then what does that actually mean in terms of how this evidence interacts with the rulemaking process and interacts with transparency in a democracy and understanding what our government's actually doing? Okay, so the way we were, I'll go through the agenda. He's like chomping at the bit. Okay, so here's the way we started thinking about this. Well, so are there any standards that says what scientific evidence can be used or should be used in rulemaking? It certainly has been used. We can probably all think of examples where this has come up. So what's the state of the law right now? And then I think we were going to get into, is that sufficient? Does that cover all the cases? Are there other things we should be thinking about? Are there issues that come up when we frame this in terms of sort of evidentiary basis, transparency, and an access to knowledge issue? And then we have some motivating examples that we would actually be happy to just spend the whole time on the examples too, if that's where people want to go. So we can kind of do that. Yeah.
Could you also talk about, I guess, what the alternative is to like non-evidence-based policymaking? Sounds pretty damning.
But maybe that's what happens today. I mean, isn't that basically?
I have no idea. I'm
Yeah.
very far from politics and law.
Okay,
and so if you could talk a little bit about.
Yeah, so let's be really, really clear. So we're really scoping this issue to say, okay, so it doesn't have to be, say, an academic, but let's say there's an academic who's producing some scientific results. It could be, say, like in bioinformatics or something, and those results could then feed into some policy around, say, stem cells or something like this. And so what's that mechanism that makes sure that can or should not or whatever be incorporated in there? And my understanding is that's really rare, that leap over. There's a few key examples. We can even just sort of jump to them if you want to know them. But in general, I don't think they're searching the scientific literature and the scholarly record to come up with understanding how policy should be made. Yes, Helen?
I mean, just to respond to your question, there are things like values-based policy making, where you hit like rock bottom on evidence. You know, is a fetus a person or something,
Yeah, right.
and then you have to make a values call.
Yeah, and that from and to add to that point, it is logical and safe to assume, particularly in an academic environment, that one would base decisions on data and evidence. That should be right the default in virtually all issues where one can quantify a decision-making matrix. Right? Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. As in fact is the case, and the real challenge is even in areas where there is science and where there is data and where there are empirical studies, there is, I think, as Victoria alluded to, a trend away from using that data for a variety of reasons that are somewhat beyond the scope of the paper in terms of sussing out the politics, but there are political aspects to it. There are also literally just programmatic and time-based reasons for it. All right, I'll give you one quick example before we dive back in here, but in my own experience in legislative arenas, even today, you will have stacks of paper, right? Paper. We're not talking about spreadsheets even. We're talking about paper on desks of mid-level staffers who want information but may not literally be able to access it because there's too much paper to go through. So it's not necessarily nefarious, but there's a variety of reasons why that might happen.
Right. So it's not the case that people start in politics typically that people start and say, let's look at the evidence and see where it leads us, right? Science gets quoted all the time, but it's somebody who has a desired policy outcome and they go and find something that is science or sounds like science that they can quote in support of it.
That's generally speaking true. Yeah, and so the question, that's sort of, we're trying to dig into what should be happening, because that seems a little bit dishonest, right? Like if you're just cherry picking pieces that support or sound like good sound bites on the talk shows or whatnot. Yeah.
And the fun thing is we have examples to talk about from the last 24 hours to lay out this issue. So
Right.
so it's
Nothing more recent.
Yeah, that's right. I can't do better. I can check during the presentation. I might find something else for you.
Okay, so this is basically what I was saying. So we're asserting that this use of scientific findings is increasingly being used to inform law, policy, creation of regulations in the government. So an example we have coming up is the EPA deciding on particulate concentrations for air pollution standards. And this has an enormous impact on industry. My understanding is small changes in what are permissible levels can be very expensive for industry, or sort of be a boon for them for that year or whatever. And so it becomes very contentious, and the idea that you would use evidence about what harms are caused from these particulate levels seems very natural, right? So you might be happy with that reasoning. Okay, so that's something that with more access to information, maybe they could be more, ideally the policy would be more informed by the scientific research. Okay, so our question is, should standards adhere to scientific findings used as the basis for policy making, and what should these standards be? Okay.
And so, right, we both have legal backgrounds, but I guess as the even more lawyer of the two of us,
Oh, way more.
I'll cover the law stuff. So you know, to frame the issue, up on this slide, you've got in the first 3 bullets are 3 federal laws that deal primarily with the regulation of information internally within government and information that is shared with the public. In a nutshell, and I'm happy to go into more detail on this as well, the Administrative Procedure Act is the act that sets up regulatory rulemaking procedures. So anyone that's had any experience submitting comments and the like to an administrative entity, be it the Department of Energy or the Copyright Office, you go down a list, you deal with the APA. The APA sets in motion a pretty strict procedure for what questions can be asked and how, what kinds of processes can go into entering comments into a public record, what hearings look like, and the like.
Would you, if you were putting questions in to sort of send out to the public, would you get them vetted first?
So it would be nice to
Okay.
have those kinds of questions potentially vetted. One of the interesting kickers in all 3 of these first bullets, which are, to be clear, acts that are currently on the books, is that they focus very heavily, if not exclusively, on the disclosure requirements of government. Now, those disclosure requirements, of course, are critical for theories of democracy that go back hundreds of years, or even for more recent theories of democracy, including deliberate democracy theory and reason giving and the like. What is interesting about but not only the APA, but the Data Quality Act and FOIA, is that they don't say much, if anything, about what agencies themselves and legislatures should be doing with information internally. Now, there are presumptions, like the question that were just asked, that would give, right, a basis for thinking, well, logically you do X, Y, or Z. But these regulations don't set forth much in the way of even principles for decision makers, be they staffers or elected officials, to actually know what to do with data when they receive it.
And there seems to be almost, at least in our research, almost no guidelines on, with very few small exceptions, on if you want to use scientific information or output from the scientific community in your deliberations or decision making, what's the guidance? There just seems to be very, very little that addresses that issue.
That's right, and the APA has that particular range. The Data Quality Act is a more recent act that focuses on what it sounds like. It was designed to be, and it's, at this point, it's about 10 plus years old, not much more than that, designed to be a federal reg to get at some of the questions that we're referring to here, but again, more from a disclosure perspective rather than an internal decision-making perspective. The Data Quality Act, more than anything else, requires that federal agencies create regulations around basic principles like data quality and even reproducibility, which is something Victoria's focused on heavily, but again, doesn't lay out more specifics than that. Now, a side note, of course, from a regulatory perspective, is whether we want regulations to be so specific that they prevent flexibility in the use of information, which is something we can talk about as well. But again, the Data Quality Act also doesn't say a lot about internal decision making, although to be clear, it is by far the one that's closest on point to what we're doing. FOIA, which is probably the most well-known of these 3 acts, the Freedom of Information Act, is what it is designed to be, and it has done it relatively well. It was designed post-Watergate, right, and through that era to create a default of transparency and access to information within government. There are very powerful exceptions to FOIA, some of which I work on heavily, including national security and for trade secret information and the like. But the Freedom of Information Act is probably the least relevant to our inquiry because it is so focused on merely disclosure and not really any other use of information.
So how would I know if, suppose I was interested in how some EPA regs came about, how would I know to even ask the question about scientific data and scientific findings?
You'd have to be in rooms like this.
Yeah.
Which is kind of where this question comes from, right? I mean, the best FOIA requests that are made tend to come from subject matter experts, who are often the people who would have access to the information anyway by virtue of knowing staffers and being in that field. An enormous challenge of access information generally, right? And I am going to quote the former Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, the unknown, for those of you that don't like that quote, and it's particularly, yes, thank you, Andrea, particularly loaded quote. The unknown, however, is a useful way, particularly coming as he did from DOD, to think about the kinds of questions that we might want to ask but don't even have the ability to ask. So without endorsing Rumsfeld or his leadership, the unknown idea is an interesting one to think about. The proposed legislation I referred to here are cut in two directions. In one direction, they are designed to at least get more public access to decision-making information within regulatory entities. However, as Victoria will talk about a little bit, the word transparency has become a bit of a meme or slogan rather than a meaningful word, and therefore transparency is now being used to actually prevent public access to some information or at least stifle some decision-making. So I will stop there so that we can get into these broader principles unless there are questions here.
I wanted to ask, are there any standards, like as I understand how the process works, the sort of you have an agency which is deliberative on some rulemaking process, and subject matter experts can sort of throw responsive, like the agency puts out a set of questions and subject matter experts might throw responsive stuff back over the wall, but there really isn't a notion other than, internal to the agency there's subject matter expertise of there being some outside force that helps them interpret what that stuff actually means. And courts have a very different approach to this.
Right. So
there's an adversarial selection.
We started thinking about Daubert, actually.
Yeah.
I don't want to cut you off.
No, please. I'll go ahead.
That was about it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So fine. So, by the way, we're also in the early stages of working together on presentations, so that works out nice. So yeah. With regard to that issue, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. First is there are, of course, ways to attempt to influence decision making from the outside through formal mechanisms, right? So the U.S. Trade Representative has advisory councils. Other entities, of course, have similar bodies, but of course, they are created by the entity through statutory authority, and they choose who they're talking to through that formal selection process, and that's a side issue that I'm going to do my best to not talk about here, because I already talk about it plenty with regard to access information in trade and the like. So that's one thing. The other thing to keep in mind, of course, is what these standards don't talk about, and which maybe we don't want them to talk about, are those informal relationships that exist between knowledgeable people and policymakers that we wouldn't want to prevent, right, in the event that we came up with a set of standards and principles, which is something Victoria's going to talk about in more detail. So, I mean, of course, we've got former staffers in this room who have their own experience with that. My sense, and it's a strong one, not at the federal, but really at the state level as a staffer, at the federal level trying to influence it, is that it is a largely standardless area, and while that doesn't mean there should be specific regulations along the lines of what FOIA would say is exempt, principles, right, would be quite useful. I don't know, Victoria, if you want to add to that.
I was going to add a couple things. So one of the articles that Dave and I looked at, I think this morning, either that or late, it's all a blur, late last night or this morning, is there's a bill I think that was just passed in the House, and I have it here, I can jump out and look it up, trying to provide some standards as to who could provide input to you mentioned those sort of, not quite advisory bodies, but these sort of expert groups or whatnot that might advise, say, an agency on their rulemaking. So, for example, in the case of the EPA, this rule said that if scientists were authors, for example, on work that was being considered as part of the regulatory process, then they were not permitted to actually get involved or talk about it because they were seen to have a conflict of interest. And the article that we read was saying, well, this is a little weird because it excludes a lot of experts, because if you're a co-author on this, you probably do have something to say, but now you're excluded. And it doesn't reach people like, for example, industry folks who are also influenced by these regulations, but they sort of have this unfettered kind of ability to get in there and talk to folks, whereas if your work's being relied upon, you're out of the sort of process, in a sense. So that's only in the House, and if you're interested, I can bring it up. But I think that's perhaps what you were referring to when you said sometimes that things can be sort of a little bit flipped. I think the EPA example is a good one, but it's also kind of a specialized and a complicated one in some sense.
Also weirdly fraught with politics.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're not particularly motivated by the whole climate science debate and so on in doing this. But the more we look at this, the more you can't avoid climate when you start talking about these issues. That's the elephant in the living room. Like, how do you deal with? And is a body like IPCC effective in sort of disseminating information to policymakers and so on, or is it a model that could be put into other areas and so on? So we're sort of stumbling upon climate again and again.
Yeah, and even energy regulation as well,
Yeah.
both at the state and federal level, is a huge motivator in this work. We're not focusing at the state level, but as states have dealt with the regulation of hydraulic fracturing, they come headlong into external and internal scientific data, some of which, in my experience, they don't want to see. Right, particularly as it relates to chemical formulae and the like for what's going in the ground, even though it's coming from reputable external sources, their dealings with that kind of data, partially because of politics, partially because of expertise, and partially because of a rush to get regulation in place, has put this issue front and center at a state level where you have a wide variety of procedures in place for dealing with any of it. Some states have none at all, right, or nothing meaningful to very strict kind of APA-style procedures.
Is there a less fraught hypo, something that's like really very cut and dry, like statistics? You know, the Department of Labor has a bunch of really good statisticians in BLS, and maybe there's some other agency that doesn't have that in-house capability, but they want to, I don't know, interpret figures from BLS or from externally somewhere, and they would like to somehow outsource that or hire that.
That's a nice example. I mean, one of the things that comes into this thinking as well is, and I'll talk about this, these sort of executive memoranda, executive orders around transparency and data that's especially being produced by the federal agencies. And that's, my understanding is that that's part of the impetus, like the whole idea that, labor's producing stats that could be useful to other agencies and they're not getting out to the other agencies, just, I guess, struck people as kind of insane. So I think that was a lot of the motivation around data.gov and so on, to really try and at least get ability to access the data in the different agencies. But some of these examples that we have, it's either come to us through the press or people, like I give talks, and then just like you did, people will come up to me with a particular example. So it's a little bit like we sort of, it's not like we haven't been able to survey the landscape and choose ones that look good because it's so hidden.
A lot of the advocacy that happens based on scientific arguments happens informally, right? That someone will come in a mode of advocacy to a decision maker in an agency, and they'll make an argument, they'll refer to a paper by Smith and Jones or whatever,
Right.
and or it'll be on a PowerPoint that they bring in and then walk away with. So there's no documentary record, there's no minutes for the meeting that say that what their scientific argument was. And if you're a technical expert working inside an agency, part of your job is to write that down in your pad and make sure that the decision maker understands afterward, by the way, that argument they were making based on the Smith and Jones paper, that's bogus, the Smith and Jones paper is discredited.
Right.
But a lot of it goes on that way, sort of orally, not on a record.
That's right.
And
so I testified for Congress in March of, I think, 2013, I guess. And this was for the Science Technology Space Committee. They had a subcommittee actually on research transparency. And it's very similar to what you were saying, but I would add one other thing. So at least when you testify, so they set the agenda. There was stuff they wanted to hear about. I mean, you could, go and just start talking about whatever you wanted. I mean, they're not going to shut your mic off, but they might, sort of push you a bit. But it makes sense to talk about things they're actually receptive to. And so one of my areas of research is reproducibility, so I talked about that. And so the trick that I use to try and help that process along is they ask for your testimony in written form beforehand so that it can be entered in the Federal Register. And so what I did is I'll talk about this in a little bit, or maybe now, but there's lots of movement within the scientific community, not about policy-making issues per se, but about transparency in what they're doing and access to what they're doing, particularly on the computational side. And so there are documents that groups of scientists and other stakeholders, like, for example, funding agencies and other folks and journals and publishers and so on, there's a series of statements where they've come together and sort of collaboratively written how we'd like things to be, what we need as a community, where we need to go, and so on. And I just kind of stapled that to my testimony. So that got into, I don't know when anyone read it, but at least it sort of got in there. So I was trying to sort of insert things in, but, there's not a structured way to do this, for sure.
No, and unlike court proceedings, right, where you have formal process that exists and clerks that enter documents and number them and label them. This is what happens, and I will say also that, and to Ed's point, the law doesn't require that oral information be kept as a record at all. Right, so if you happen to have a court reporter there, which often you will in a hearing, right? Usually you will. You might have a record of that, but these kinds of conversations that occur, if there isn't a court reporter and it isn't written down, it's gone.
Right, and that, I think, unfortunately, hearings, account for, I think, a minority of the scientific information that the members get.
That's probably true.
Right, a lot more of it happens in advocacy meetings, which are not really on the record.
Right, and
they're not on the record. Sorry, just one second.
Yes.
They're not on the record. They may not be publicized. Who gets invited may be a very biased sample. I mean, I've seen meetings. I mean, my area is, how we're doing science, how that interacts with federal funding, and so on. So, in that particular narrow tranche, I've seen these meetings where just the industry folks were turning up to try and talk about laws that were going to affect all, things like that. So, sorry.
so I was going to say, I was actually asking the question more from the perspective in courts, not of recording what information goes into the record, but of the process of, say, certifying an expert, saying this person has the capacity to interpret this information, this technical information.
The courts are notoriously not that great at that, and notoriously also, there's lots of work on standards of evidence that would be admitted to courts, lots and lots and lots of work on that, and I think there's parallels in the types of things that we're talking about in this project where there's very little work that had been done, but it's similar. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's lots of questions around what those standards for evidence, scientific evidence in a courtroom would actually be as well. So.
Yeah, that is a. I'm sorry.
In a courtroom, it seems to me like it doesn't matter so much that you get it exactly right, because you have an adversarial process, right? The other side can also sort of bring in their somewhat biased interpretation of the same data.
Yeah, if you're referring to expert certification under the federal rules, like Rule 30b-6, the Federal Civil Procedure, which many people in this room would qualify for if they were asked and so forth. The 30b-6, is that what you're referring to with the certification? I don't mean by rule. And I'm not. This is the law professor. What rule are you referring to? No, I don't mean that. Next, moving on. The standards for certifying experts under the federal rules are designed, I think, to replicate the kinds of scientific inquiry standards that we would have. However, and that we would certainly call for. However, and this is now anecdata, my own personal experience, but it's happened repeatedly, there's a skepticism that exists around that certification process, as Victoria's alluded to, that I have seen where I have had federal judges in cases involving legitimate 30b-6 type issues say, I'm not interested in the expert opinion here because of those inherent biases that exist in a process of certification. So even if you get certified, right, that doesn't make that certification, or it doesn't create the imprimatur of persuasiveness, right? You can say you're an expert and I choose to ignore you, right? And that's perfectly permissible. That, and I think it's a great point, because that is akin to what I think we often see when scientific data enters a record or simply gets in the ear of a staffer, right? I'm sure you know what you're talking about. Moving on. All right, and that's where the standards, I think,
Yeah.
kick in.
So I just wanted to mention the last point here, which is sort of a teaser for where we're going. So public access to data from federally funded research. So there is, so the Office of Management and Budget has a circular, this A110, that defines what it calls data, and then this has been sort of a springboard for several efforts in this area that I'm going to talk about subsequently. So let's just move on. Okay, so so we have these. We were, as Dave mentioned earlier, so our focus was really what principles should we be thinking about when we think about this issue. And I think knowing what's in place or what's largely not in place is helpful for framing how we might bridge from principles to practice. But here are some of the principles that we've been considering. So you mentioned already this unknown unknowns.
Right.
Right. How do we disclose them? So there's a couple of ways we can break this out. So these, I think actually most of these have come up in conversation already, but how do we know what scientific results were relied on or how they were relied on and what their influence actually was if they were used at all? Can we understand how, like going back even one step, so how those findings were created? So what was the original data that those findings relied on? How was that inference carried out if this is something that had computational aspects in the scientific discovery process, which the vast majority of scientific research does now? Can we actually follow this and have sort of computational transparency in the scientific findings themselves? So what kind of credibility do we need to ascribe to these results? I think you've talked about this a fair amount. Would something like, if these results were independently verified, is that something that's important for us to think about as a standard for reliance on these findings? I mean, the scientific literature is rife with small studies or studies that failed to replicate later or didn't generalize and so on, but are still, barring things like misconduct and fraud and so on, but are still in the scholarly record as part of a conversation around these issues and so on. So at what point is something sort of ripe enough to be relied upon? Like what are those standards that make it reliable? How do we think about things like whether or not a scientific finding is germane to the actual policy questions at hand, or is this something that really doesn't actually speak to the actual issues? Does it make any difference if this is a finding from a million years ago, or does a more recent finding have any sort of weight, or what's the actual questions that are actually, like how tight is the question that the scientist is asking and answering to the actual policy questions that are being asked and hopefully answered with these scientific findings? Another thing we've mentioned a couple of times, I just called it completeness. So this idea that it's super easy to search the scholarly literature and come up with something that will support your viewpoint, pretty much whatever it is. It's even easier to take something that supports your viewpoint out of some data. And so that's the sort of like torturing the data and getting whatever facts you like. And so the question is, well, is there more than just one study? Do we have a representative view of where the conversation is in the research community? And how do we actually get a sense for this? Or is this even something that's important? Or is it something where disclosure's enough? I mean, there's a lot of conflict of interest discussions in, say, universities, and I've been exposed to a few recently, just at the policy level, not at the personal level. And so one of the things that people seem to assume, at least in conflict of interest, if you just disclose, it all goes away, right? Like as long as people know, then they'll make their own judgments. And so is there a principle like that around, as long as the sort of like citizens know what research was relied on or what was used, then that's enough? Or do we need to kind of go one step further and sort of ensuring some type of reliability in there, or some type of representativeness or quality, whatever that means, in terms of the scientific findings that were actually used? Would you require something like the paper has been peer reviewed? Would you require something like it's published in the scholarly record? What if there's a research paper that comes from, say, a foundation? Or what if there's a research paper that comes from industry? How are these, should they be treated differently or not? Or should they have the same standards of germaneness or recency or replication or whatever it is that that peer-reviewed published papers might have? I throw these out there. And then, did you put public input on
I put public input in brackets.
Okay.
In brackets, you're seeing a redlined version of slides. No, they actually, but the bracket, there is actually a method to that bracket and question mark in case you really wanted to be sure that we weren't sure. You know, input processes are not necessarily anything to do per se with decision making, right? So the input would often come through the regulatory process of hearings, right, and of those informal discussions. The reason why I had it in brackets is because I'm not sure that it's a guiding principle internally for the use of scientific data and evidence, because perhaps we want a process that is cleaner, that allows for internal deliberation, that allows for a kind of deliberative process privileges that exist in the law, so that tough decisions can be made, decisions that may not be politically palatable, decisions that may anger a certain constituency, can be made or at least discussed without the glare. That's the challenge that Jeremy Bentham laid out hundreds of years ago with regard to transparency generally, and that's why that's in brackets. So if you stick around for the future, that may not be there. But for now, it's something I wanted to float as a thought.
The other thing too is I'm sort of we're sort of putting some ideals out here, but there is the countervailing principles that underlie all of these discussions, things like efficiency and how much you want to burden the regulatory system with all these standards and so on, and slow things down even more and so on. So that's we're aware of those issues there in the background. But first step is really kind of, well, what would our gold standard be if we could think about this in isolation? Yes.
So it seems like almost none of these have sort of ground truths associated with them, that all of this is, even in the scientific world, are very fluid. You know, a paper is published, it gets reviewed, it gets maybe refuted, and this is an ongoing discussion. Is there any sense of maybe there's an ongoing discussion as policy is passed, and either a mechanism or a principle for revisiting past decisions? I mean, if you're basically laying out principles for guiding decision making, and then you find out later that maybe the evidence that you were basing that decision on was wrong, or the decision making process was wrong.
Right. So it's like a GitHub for laws, basically. So
Yeah,
you know what
sure.
version?
I think it was sort of like, I was thinking more like PageRank of citations.
But a notion of revisiting, right, and asking, are the scientific conclusions that we reached based on the science of the time still valid, and if not, then some.
Yeah, and what's our updating mechanism?
Will happen, yeah.
So there's okay, I am gonna leap ahead here. Okay, hang on. Okay, so we anticipated.
Did you get all that?
Yeah, we anticipated a big
Wait on that third one.
discussion. Yeah. So this is part of the EPA discussion that I started earlier. So with the air particulate regulations, you might have even heard some of this. There's sort of this latent, ongoing, sort of small brouhaha that just sort of persists in Congress because they want access to the data that underlies those findings that were then used to ground those sort of regulations that the EPA come up with at those particulate levels. And it's a challenging case for me because as someone who does think that open data, transparency, and scientific processes and communication is very important, I'm not on the side actually of opening those. It's two particular studies that about human impacts that those regulations are based on. And the reason I'm not open to it is these two studies, the data sets that they're made on are longitudinal human subject studies started in the 1970s, and there's all sorts of protections around, having human subjects in, and you can't just kind of toss this open, even aside from the fact that that's what these people were told when they were enrolling in this study too, that all their information would be held confidential. It's all their health records and so on. And so I don't think that's a case where open data is appropriate, aside from the fact that it's illegal, right, to reveal people's health records. But even on principle, I think that's the right thing. So what they did is, so you can see that it says, or maybe it's too small to see, reanalysis of the Harvard 6 study and the American Cancer Society study of particulate air pollution and mortality. So they said, okay, so here's another researcher who's going to then redo it, and you could imagine another researcher being able to be in that confidentiality circle around those human subjects data. It's opening it to everybody indiscriminately. That's the problem. Having someone who goes through the protocols, understands it's part of the study, adding them to the study generally isn't a problem. And so maybe they can go do the reanalysis. And so if you're interested, that stuff's out there. But that's how they chose to deal with this issue of maybe things have changed, maybe we should verify the results, maybe there's updating to be done. In this case, they largely confirmed the results that were done at Harvard and the American Cancer Society study. But I don't know that. I'm not in that small circle, and I didn't follow their actual results and conclusions. But that's the best we can do. That's what we've got.
Peter, did you have your?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of related more to that public input. Sort of.
And so thrilled to have a lethal robots expert here again. I just want to get.
Yeah, well, given the background, my background in science and technology studies, I find all this very fascinating. But I'm also thinking about, you have in law, you have things like amicus briefs and ways in which lawyers are sort of used to sort of presenting policy advice, testifying and things. And scientists don't really do that. I mean, there's peer review and things like that where they comment on each other's work in various stages, but they don't really have this sort of practice. So I'm wondering, like, so you have this data. Do you have the scientists themselves who are supposed to try to figure out how their work relates to policy, or do you have these sort of other intermediaries, and who are they that are sort of scouring this scientific database and trying to figure out the relevance to it and evaluate it and things like that, and then would produce these kinds of
I have a lot of opinions on that. So, and the larger issue of what's the role of a scientist in society, which is really kind of what you're asking. So, in my impression, in the academic scientific community, you are first of all motivated to only really look at your own work. And I mean, you look at other people who are related to your work, but you're not looking at policy issues. You're not looking at downstream issues. In fact, it's sort of a distraction. And what you're rewarded for this sort of very narrow focus on the science, and in fact you might even be, maybe you're influenced by bias or something if you're paying too much attention to all these other things. You're going to be pure, kind of. And so there's no kind of decorations around what we do in the scientific community, and in fact it's disdained, right? Like in the scientific community, even people who write books that sell, in popular books that sell are disdained because they're selling out to celebrity and so on. And so as a result, what the scientific community does pretty well is get scientific conclusions out there. What they don't do well is like any tiny little step beyond that. And so even things like communicating the science to the public, things like advocating, it's unseemly and so on, there's no kind of mechanisms for how that gets translated out accurately. Well, I shouldn't say no, there's university press offices and so on, but there's no sort of recognized larger structure that's responsible for this and does this. And so, I mean, if you just even think about the stuff about it comes out in drips and drabs and often is probably reported in a confusing way and so on. So that's something I've definitely been thinking about that a lot. Like, how does that, what should bolster what the scientist is doing? I don't think the scientist themselves is ever going to take, the skill sets are so different. I don't think they're going to just kind of take that on. But we do have a gap there.
Maybe you're coming to your case studies, and this may preempt, but an area where it seems like there is a reasonable cycle of evidence into policy is in the kind of food nutrition area. Is that?
So that's not in our example, so that's good. So I'm not an expert in that area, so please, sort of chime in if I say something completely crazy. But that's a place where it's really hard to do good scientific studies because it's very difficult to understand how, for example, a food or nutritional change would impact, because we don't really do controlled studies in that area. And then they have to be longitudinal over time, and sometimes the time, like you get cancer 20 years after or whatever it was, and so on. So it's really hard, I think, to pick up sort of very grounded results in that area.
So like
That's
the
my impression.
latest standards that were just publicized about a week ago, is this kind of bogus? What do you, not informed by science?
Are you referring to the ones where they say, oh, all the stuff that we
Like
thought was
sugar.
bad for
Eggs are
cholesterol?
fine,
eggs are good for you.
Yeah. So you're not talking to an expert. My sense, just on my own mind, is probably.
and also, maybe I think framing is also important. We're not suggesting in this paper that scientific data and evidence has standard list free roaming appeal throughout government, and government can do whatever it wants. And if it doesn't make a decision based upon scientific evidence where it could, that is always bad, and you always need that kind of evidence. So I think part of the framing is important here. That there isn't. Are we sure? Okay. The nutshell is this. There, I think, are the preemptive examples that would suggest ways in which governmental entities can use science in informed decision-making processes. Part of it goes back to an earlier question and point, which is the relative controversy around the particular decision. To the extent that the decision itself is one that lacks heavy debate or controversy or frankly publicity, I generally think it has been easier for administrators and staffers and others to use data, right? And so that's part of it as well, that there is less debate around food standards from a political standpoint as much as the idea that we'd rather not die from what we eat.
Well, does anybody know what studies undergirded those decisions?
So for the
Right, that's my question.
so for the nutritional one, I think they said that the studies were initially done by the Harvard Medical School, and they recently proved that it wasn't right. Basically, it was a bogus
So
study.
we need all that info, right? Like that should be, so I think that should be all kind of linked in articles that talk
Yeah.
about it, and we should be able to
So
sort of
a lot of articles are being published online, but it's just that the American Nutrition Standard, whatever, they took the studies which were done by the Harvard Medical School, and those have been proved wrong.
So
the American
what does it
nutritionists-
mean proved wrong, and what was actually wrong
independent
with them? And
studies-
why were those ones chosen, and what
Exactly.
were those standards? And
Yeah.
so those are all the questions I think there's a larger discussion that I think as a community we're just starting to have. Like it's just kind of in a way sort of thrilling that the scientific studies are even entering the debate.
Yeah.
So the next step is really, well, what does it mean, and what are those standards?
I think
Yeah.
this is an interesting area actually, because this is an area where there is an expert agency, right? We have NIH, who ostensibly their job is to produce
I don't know if they do
studies
nutrition.
for
FDA.
Yeah.
Well, FDA,
yeah.
somewhere in there.
Yeah.
So somewhere between FDA and NIH, there's someone whose job it is to produce studies that produce this kind of information digestible for policymakers, for the making of this kind of policy.
Well, if you can point me to them, I would love to see it, 'cause I don't know if it's digestible for policymakers. I haven't seen it.
So I have a sort of a higher level question or comment maybe is, you know, one of the things that something like this that comes to mind is the issue of, you know, okay, we've come around to new nutritional guidance, and now you need this many units of vitamin B, whatever. If the framework isn't set up right, does that all of a sudden become something that somebody else could use to the detriment of this? In other words, if somebody says, see, science comes back and refutes what they said before, you know,
Sure.
there-
Well, I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding in general about how science works.
Exactly,
And
yeah.
we're not sort of discovering facts. We've got our fact, and we discover the next fact, and we've got that fact, and then we've got another truth, and we move on.
Right.
Yeah.
So I
That's
just
right.
wonder if, depending on how the framework is set up, if it doesn't amplify those kinds of
Sure,
biases
sure.
against the
But
scientific
I
method.
would be a little more optimistic than that and say that's a learning opportunity.
Okay.
You know,
A teachable moment,
Yeah.
that is.
I hope, because that
Yeah.
is how it's supposed to be used.
Right.
Right, that we do say, okay, so now we can do better. We've got better measurement tools, we've got better equipment, and we found these flaws, and the conversation continues. I think that's what people should get out of it. But that also goes back to your point of having being able to sort of trace the scientific thinking that went into this. Is there some mechanism that allows us to be more comprehensive about how these things have changed and understand this better? I mean, my understanding with the initial guidelines, again, this is not my area, so I'm not an expert in how nutritional standards are set. But there did seem to be a lot of industry input back in the day when grain was such a huge proportion, and that's my understanding of this. And so we seem to know a little bit about that process, what it was, that mechanism, and how are we improving on that, and what information kind of went into that, and then how can we kind of do better and learn from that. I think that's kind of what we're really trying to get to here.
And being being the merely the lawyer who doesn't have the PhD background, I'm a hangers-on on that, looking at it from a policy perspective. And it was a great book related to this from a few years ago involving the tobacco industry, whose author escapes me, but it's called "Doubt Is Our Product," right?
Yeah.
Based upon FOIA, incidentally FOIA documents that indicated quite clearly that there was a strategy of the tobacco industries to create scientific doubt, right, if you will, around the dangers of tobacco, right? So that would be a manipulation of a process that's designed to create a standard by which data could be assessed. I would view it, and this is again early days in our project, but I would view that almost as an externality, right? In other words, that's a risk associated with having to create a standard that allows for one who isn't stepped in the research and may not even know scientific method that well to have a principled way to approach the data. On that point regarding expertise within government, that's a critical one as well. And a lot of this becomes a question not of, again, to be clear, we don't want to make a good decision, but we are incapable of making a good decision because we lack resources. By way of one example, again, and this has come up in hydraulic fracturing, to the extent that government entities, yeah, you can go to it quickly, because I know we're short on time, but the nutshell is, there we go. So, the fracking process, which, and again, industry would say fracking is almost pejorative, hydraulic fracturing, but it fits on the slide better to call it fracking, right, is a process of horizontal drilling that includes the injection of liquids into wells in order to extract energy. Again, related directly to this point, this was the 24-hour data, although now it's merely a week, less than a week. Sorry, it's not as current as I would like. A report, right, a scientific study from the AAS indicating that there is a risk associated with the treatment of the waste products associated with fracking. Now, this is highly controversial from a political standpoint, putting aside the science, because it directly raises one of those harms. To the extent that there's going to be a process that would allow for decision makers to, in good faith, use this data, that would be a positive result, obviously, from what we're trying to achieve. However, manipulation of that process could allow for unwarranted challenges to the method used here in a way that could prevent its use. Again, we're so early in this, and I'm hesitant to say this is how we do it, but I'm willing to take that risk. When governments deal with these issues, a lot of times, in my experience, they want to make the right decision, and then they'll say, who do we have inside here who can make that decision for us and help? And we don't have the people inside, and we don't have the money to pay outside experts.
That's very common.
Yeah.
Very, very common.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's what.
And I think so. Joanna, should we wrap it up here?
Wrap it up.
Okay.
Okay.
So thank you very much, but we'll stick around and continue.